People who got fired then became so successful their company begged them to return. In 1985, Steve Jobs was arguably the most exciting figure in the entire technology industry. He had built Apple from a garage into a company that changed how the world thought about computers. His name was synonymous with innovation, with boldness, with the future itself. And then his own board voted him out. But what makes this story extraordinary isn't just the fall. It's what happened in between. And the remarkable truth that the company which fired Steve Jobs would spend the next 12 years slowly dying, until the only cure left was the man they had discarded. The person they pushed out the door was the same person who would one day walk back through it and save everything. To understand what was lost in 1985, you have to go back to the beginning, to a garage in Los Altos, California, where two young men, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, were building something the world had never seen before: a personal computer. The idea was radical. Computers in the 1970s were enormous institutional machines. They lived in universities and corporations, operated only by specialists. The notion that an ordinary person might one day have one on their desk was not just ambitious, it was considered laughable by most of the industry. Jobs didn't just see the machine. He saw what the machine could become. He had a rare and almost dangerous kind of vision, the ability to look at technology and see not what it was, but what it could mean to a human being holding it in their hands. By 1984, Apple was a publicly traded company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The launch of the original Macintosh, with its graphical interface, its mouse, its famous Super Bowl advertisement, had made Steve Jobs a celebrity. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a prophet of the digital age. And that status, it turned out, would make everything that followed so much more devastating. At first, everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. Apple was growing. The press loved it. The public loved it. Steve Jobs was on the cover of magazines. He was, by every external measure, winning. He had even done something very few founders ever do voluntarily. He went out and hired an experienced CEO to help run the company. His name was John Sculley, and he had been the president of PepsiCo. Jobs personally recruited him with a line that has since become one of the most famous in Silicon Valley history. "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Sculley joined, and for a time the partnership worked. But underneath the surface of that momentum, something important was beginning to fracture. On the surface, it looked like a company thriving on bold ideas and unstoppable momentum. But in reality, a war was brewing between two men with completely incompatible ideas of what Apple was supposed to be. The Macintosh, for all its revolutionary design, was not selling the way Jobs had promised. The machine was elegant, innovative, and expensive. Apple began losing money, and inside the company, pressure mounted. Jobs and Sculley had fundamentally different philosophies. Jobs believed that great products came first, that if you built something truly extraordinary, the business would follow. Sculley believed in market research, cost management, and disciplined execution. These weren't just differences of opinion, they were collisions of identity. And as Apple's losses grew, the board began to listen more carefully to Sculley and less carefully to Jobs. Jobs could feel the ground shifting beneath him, and rather than wait for the inevitable, he made a decision that would seal his fate. Behind closed doors, Steve Jobs was planning a coup. He would wait until Sculley left the country, and then he would move. He quietly began approaching board members and executives, making his case. Sculley needed to go. The company needed to return to its founding vision. He, Steve Jobs, was the only one who could lead it there. The plan required precision. It required secrecy. What Jobs didn't account for was the leak. Someone talked. Sculley found out, not after he had left the country, but before. And when he confronted the board, something happened that Jobs had apparently not prepared for. The board sided with Sculley. Completely. In a matter of days, Steve Jobs was stripped of all operational responsibilities. He retained the title of chairman, a largely ceremonial role, but had no authority, no team, no real power within the company he had founded. Within 30 days, he was gone entirely. By September 1985, Steve Jobs had resigned from Apple. He sold nearly all of his Apple stock and walked away from the company that bore his fingerprints on every product, every decision, every pixel. He started a new company called Next, aiming to build high-end computers for universities. But Next struggled. The machines were extraordinary, too expensive, too ahead of their time. The company burned through cash and never found the market Jobs had imagined. Meanwhile, back at Apple, something far more serious was happening. Apple wasn't just struggling, it was bleeding. The company lost billions of dollars. Its market share collapsed. It cycled through executives who couldn't agree on what the company was supposed to be. And the problem, which would only become clear in hindsight, was software. The computing world was changing beneath Apple's feet. Microsoft was building an empire on Windows. Apple's operating systems were aging, creaking, and Apple didn't have the modern software it needed to survive. By the mid-1990s, Apple was less than 90 days from total bankruptcy. Industry analysts were writing its obituary. The question wasn't whether Apple would survive. It was who would buy its remaining assets when it finally collapsed. In 1996, Apple's CEO made a desperate decision. Apple needed a modern operating system, and it needed one fast. So he went looking to buy one from the outside. There were two real candidates. One was a small company called B Incorporated. The other was Next, the company Steve Jobs had built in exile. The board chose Next. They paid $427 million for it. They didn't just buy a software company. They bought back the one person who had ever truly understood what Apple was supposed to be. Jobs returned to Apple as an advisor. Then his influence grew. Then the sitting CEO resigned. And on September 16, 1997, exactly 12 years to the day after he had originally left, Steve Jobs was named CEO of Apple once again. The company that once pushed him out the door now needed him to walk back through it. Or there would be no door left to walk through. Most leaders, returning to a company in crisis, would try to fix everything at once. Jobs did the opposite. He didn't try to fix everything. He cut everything. Apple in 1997 had dozens of products, computers in every configuration, printers, cameras, handheld devices, server machines. It was a company that had tried to be everything to everyone and had become, as a result, nothing special to anyone. Within weeks of returning, he canceled approximately 70% of Apple's product line. Not because those products were all bad, but because focus is a form of power. He reduced Apple's entire strategy to 4 products, built with everything the company had, for 4 clearly defined types of customers. The move was shocking. Analysts called it reckless. But Jobs had diagnosed the disease correctly. Apple hadn't failed because it lacked resources. It had failed because it had scattered those resources across too many battlefields at once. Now, for the first time in over a decade, Apple would stand for something clear. What followed was one of the most remarkable corporate turnarounds in history. The iMac came first, a colorful, strikingly beautiful computer that looked like nothing else on the market. It sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months. Apple was profitable again within a year of Jobs' return. Then came the iPod, a device that didn't just change Apple, it changed the entire music industry. Then iTunes. Then the iPhone, which didn't just change the phone industry, it rendered entire categories of other devices obsolete overnight. Cameras, GPS units, music players, maps, all absorbed into a single device that fit in your pocket. He took a company that was weeks away from extinction and turned it into the most valuable business on earth. The company that had been 90 days from bankruptcy in 1997 became, in 2011, the most valuable publicly traded company in the world. Worth more than ExxonMobil, more than Microsoft, more than any company in the history of capitalism at that point. The exile had returned, and he had done more than save the company. He had transformed it into something nobody could have predicted in those desperate, dark days of 1997. But this story isn't really about Steve Jobs. Not entirely. It's about the decisions companies make when they choose control over vision, when they let short-term pressures override long-term thinking, when they mistake management for leadership and discipline for innovation. For years, the conventional wisdom was that businesses need steady, experienced hands to scale. that founders are visionaries, yes, but that at a certain point, the professional operators need to take over. This story proves something else entirely. It proves that vision is not a phase, it is the engine. And when you remove the engine, no amount of fuel will move the car. Apple didn't fail because Steve Jobs was difficult or intense or unconventional. It failed because, without him, it lost the one thing that no spreadsheet can quantify and no management consultant can install: a clear, uncompromising sense of what it was trying to do and why it mattered. The biggest mistake a company can make isn't failure. It's pushing out the person who might have prevented it.